And we should be recording. So today we're going to start talking about connective tissues. Just to remind you, there's 4 major types of tissues in the human body. Those major tissues are epithelial, which we've already finished, connective, muscular, and nervous. This one, connective tissues, that I'm going to start talking about today is the worst one of the 4, meaning it's the most challenging as far as organization goes. So it'll most likely take me more than just one meeting to complete the connective tissues. We're not going to say a lot about muscular and nervous. I'll mention a few fun facts about those after connective, probably tomorrow. The reason is because we do the muscular system and the nervous system as an entire system, and we'll go over that tissue more in detail at that time. So I will call up a whiteboard right now and just start giving you some highlights, just as my disclaimer to this. These talks, these meetings don't replace you reading the textbook. You bought that textbook, it's expensive. You might as well use it, and that's where the meat of the detail is. The point of these meetings is for me to give you an easily understandable place or explanation that you can use then to layer on a little bit more detail. So let's first call up our whiteboard. So the main tissues, once again, are epithelial, connective, muscular, nervous, and I'm only going to talk about connective today. Your next quiz number 2, is going to come quickly. That will be this coming Thursday, and this business will be on that second quiz. First, connective tissue is the most abundant type of tissue in the human body. So there are more types of connective tissue, and it's more pervasive, more abundant than any of the other 4. And there are 4, this is on, I did post an outline of all 4 tissue types on our Canvas page for you to print out and use for review. There are 4 main classes of connective tissue. The connective tissues get to be quite challenging as far as organization. That's the whole point of me printing out that outline for you. The 4 main classes are, I'm going to put CT for connective tissue. Connective tissue proper. This is on that outline, by the way. Cartilage, bone, and fluid. So all connective tissues fall into one of these 4 main classes. We're going to go through each one at a time. The first thing I'm going to do, though, is go over common characteristics of connective tissue. That means that most connective tissues, regardless of their main class, exhibit these characteristics. I write CT a lot because it just helps me be a little bit quicker than writing out connective tissue all the time. They all have a common origin. So the origin is all the same. What we mean by origin is embryologically, as we develop as humans in utero after we are conceived, there are 3 main embryonic tissues. All connective tissues come from the same embryonic origin, and that is called mesenchyme. That's the name of the embryonic tissue that gives rise to all types of connective tissue. Also, common characteristic, all connective tissues have some varying degree of vascularity. Some hardly, that means blood supply, by the way. Some have very little blood supply, some are highly vascularized and have a lot. Also, I'm going to put a star next to this one. All connective tissues contain a non-living matrix. All connective tissues have a non-living component to them called a matrix. That's sort of unique from other tissues in the human body. Now I'm going to layer on this whiteboard and go to another one and write, that's an S, structural elements. So we're going to look at the structure of connective tissue in general. We haven't started talking about any specific ones yet. So there's something called a ground, that's not an I, sorry, I hit that by accident, substance. This is part of the matrix, part of the non-living matrix. So this ground substance is what your textbook or some anatomists call its unstructured material. And it basically is the stuff that fills the spaces between the living cells. And it contains things like, it depends on the type of connective tissue, but it contains things like fibers, proteins, fluids, polysaccharides. The fibers in connective tissue, these provide structural support. That's their purpose of some sort. So I'm going to put structure in parentheses. Helps with the framework of connective tissue. And there are three main types of fibers. So under fiber, I'm going to write, let me get my eraser. Okay, so the three main types of fibers are collagen fibers. I'm trying to get my pen back up here. These are the strongest fibers. They're full of a protein called collagen. That's where they get their name. And these are super strong. They give connective tissue its strength. Collagen, as a matter of fact, is stronger than steel, volume for volume, inch for pound. If you were to take a thread of collagen and a thread of steel, collagen is actually stronger. There are elastic fibers in many, not all, but many connective tissues. These have a different characteristic. They contain the protein elastin. That's where they get their name. And their main function is not strength so much, it's the ability for recoil. You know what elastic is. When you stretch it and let go, it bounces back to its original position. That's the same with elastic fibers. It's very, very pliable. And finally, reticular fibers, they're sort of a combination. Their characteristic are a combination between collagen and elastic. So reticular fibers are typically stronger than elastic, but not as strong as collagen. So they're thin, but strong. They don't have elastic's ability to recoil so much. So they're more pliable than pure collagen. So that talks about the fibers a little bit. Now I'm going to talk about living cells. So we've talked about ground substance, fibers, and by the way, these two make up the non-living matrix. So just to remind you, ground substance and fibers are considered the non-living component, the matrix of connective tissue. So the third main component of connective tissue are living cells. So that's a component, they make up the matrix, and living cells is the third main component. So connective tissues consist of their own type of living cells, depending on the specific type. Before I list some of those specific cells, I want you to remember that this term blast means, and this will help you throughout A&P 1 and 2. Whenever you see the word blast, it's usually a suffix for immature cell. So whenever we stick the word blast on the end of a word, it means it's an immature cell. So the blast form of a cell is an immature form. And the blast form of a cell usually secretes something. So I'm just going to write secretes the ground substance. Where that non-living stuff that we just listed above comes from are immature blast cells. So secretes ground substance and fibers. All right, so I'm going to give you some examples of specific cell types, but just so you know, the word site means a mature cell. So whenever you see blast, that means immature. Whenever you see site, that means mature cell. And blast cells grow up, develop into site cells. Now I'm going to give some examples of this. So I'm just layering on a new board, and I'm going to write. I'm still talking about cells. So examples of these would be a fibroblast is an immature cell that secretes fibers. A fibrocyte is a mature fiber cell that doesn't secrete fibers anymore. It's a mature cell that no longer secretes the fibers. These are just some examples. In cartilage, for example, so I'm going to put that in parentheses. The word chondroblast. Chondro means cartilage. So if I write chondroblast, that just means an immature cartilage cell, now you know, that secretes something. A chondrocyte is a mature cartilage cell that no longer secretes. This chondroblast that would secrete ground substance. Let's do one more. Bone as an example. If we say osteoblast, osteo means bone, blast means immature cell. So osteoblast is an immature bone cell. An osteocyte would be a mature bone cell. This one would secrete something. It also secretes ground substance. Actually, it secretes something or an organic matrix called osteoid, but let's just be consistent. Secretes ground substance. I'll talk all about osteoblasts when we study the skeletal system and study bones. This is important. There are many, many other living cells in connective tissue. And I'm going to give you a short list. It's longer than this, believe it or not. Lipid cells, I'm just going to write fat cells. White blood cells are found in connective tissue. Something called mast cells. Mast cells, what they do is they mediate or initiate the process of inflammation. So mast cells release chemicals called histamines. You've heard of antihistamines. Histamines are chemicals that cause vasodilation, which that causes inflammation. So when you take an antihistamine, when you have an allergy or a cold, what you're doing is blocking the release of these chemicals, and that shrinks swelling, that shrinks tissue, so you don't feel so stuffed up or stuffy. All right, let's do a few more cells. Macrophages are found in connective tissue. Macrophages are nonspecific immune cells that are phagocytic in nature. That means they gobble up or ingest other cells. Immune cells typically go after foreign microorganisms. Macrophages are one of the main ones. So that's a short list of other living cells that we find in connective tissue. Now I'm just going to start going through specific connective tissues, and I'll try to help you out with a drawing or two. So let's layer on top of this one, and I'm going to, now these are specific connective tissues that are found on that outline that I posted for you in Module 1. I recommend that you print that out and use that either to take notes on at some point or to at least jot something down. Then you'll have all of these connective tissues on one piece of paper. So connective tissue proper is the first main category of connective tissues. And it has subcategories, which makes this so difficult. So I'm going to put a capital A and just write loose connective tissue. I'll write loose CT, L-O-O-S-E. In this subcategory, we have 3 specific types of tissue. First, areolar connective tissue. Areolar CT is a loose connective tissue found in this main category. This is what you and I think of when we think of connective tissue. Areolar connective tissue is, it supports, these are functions, binds other tissues, and also defends infection. The reason is because it has a lot of those immune cells floating around in it, existing in it, things like macrophages. So we say it defends infection. It can also store nutrients. It can also provide nutrition because it's so highly vascularized. So the last thing I'm going to write is it's vascular. Now, where do we find this stuff? It's found, forgot my N here. It's found in the deep layers of the skin, in the dermis. So I'm just going to write found in the dermis. Those are the deeper layers of the skin. It has very loose fibers. I'm just describing this for you, then I'll draw a quick picture. This is the most widely distributed of all connective tissues. So we find this stuff all over the body. And what I meant by it's what you and I think of when we hear the word connective tissue. When you look at this stuff under a microscope, I'm going to use red just because it usually stains pink. It looks kind of like a bird's nest. There are just these fibers, and they're kind of thin. There's some of different thicknesses, fibers I mean. It just looks like a mess of fibers, and then you can see darker staining cells interspersed within this connective tissue. The reason it falls in the subcategory of loose CT, loose connective tissue, is because it is kind of open and airy looking. The fibers are not tightly packed. The cells are also not really tightly packed. So let's move on to the next one. So the next loose connective tissue, number 2 on your list, I don't have that study guide in front of me. I'm just going by memory. I think it's adipose connective tissue. When you see that, that's just fat cells. It's also very widely distributed, not quite as much as areolar. It stores lipid adipose sites would be a mature cell found in adipose connective tissue. This is just what you and I call fat, adipose tissue. So let's give some more functions. It stores lipid, nutrients. I'm going to write energy reserve. This provides fuel for our body when we don't have a readily available source of food. So we can use it as an energy source. We as humans carry a lot of adipose tissue under our skin, all over our body. We have a lot of it compared to most other mammals. And the reason for that is because our brains are so large. So the main reason that we carry a lot of this tissue under our skin and all over our body is because our brains are so large and they need a constant supply, our brains do, of energy, and adipose tissue can provide that. So it also provides insulation, helps with temperature regulation of the body, shock absorption. If you were to dissect a living person or perform surgery on a living person, most of us have a lot of this stuff around vital organs. So I'm going to write shock absorption. For example, our hearts have fat, a fairly large amount of fat around them, and that's for protection and shock absorption. Same with our kidneys and other vital organs. All right, so I'm going to location of this under skin. Under the skin, it's not part of the skin, around vital organs. It's also widely distributed. We find adipose tissue almost everywhere, even around cartilage areas in the human body. Let's move on to the next one, number 3, reticular CT. This also is the last one that falls in the loose connective tissue subcategory. The reason reticular connective tissue gets its name is because it's made up mostly of reticular fibers. This is found, it provides an internal framework for soft organs. That's where we usually find it, on the inside of soft organs. Locations would be things like, specifically, yes, of course, it's soft organs, but things like lymph nodes, spleen. These are classic locations. Those organs would basically fall apart if they didn't have this internal framework of reticular connective tissue within them. So I'm going to draw a picture. The fibers are somewhat thicker than areolar. They tend to be. So we have they almost look like, when we look at this under a microscope, unfortunately we're not live, or we're not in person for this course, but if we were to look at this on a microscopic slide, there are some fibers and then there's a huge mass. It's mostly cells. They're much more densely packed than areolar. And we just see this sea of cells. It almost looks like grapes when we look at it under a microscope. Bunches of grapes with the fibers being the stems. Just for the sake of it, I'm going to go back one board and draw a picture of adipose tissue. It would look like this. Let me get out my black pen. Adipose tissue are these cells, these adipocytes, that look like bubbles. And they're filled with a lipid droplet of fat. So these are the actual cells that I'm drawing. And they're filled with so much lipid, each individual cell, that the nucleus of the cell gets pushed off to the edge. So that's what fat looks like, or adipose tissue. Now I'll go back to my board. Reticular connective tissue. That's it. Let's go on now to our next subcategory. Just to remind you, this is where we are. We are in connective tissue proper, and we've done A, loose connective tissue, 1, 2, and 3. Now I'm going to go to B. So we're still under connective tissue proper. The second subcategory within connective tissue proper is called dense connective tissue. And we'll just label these 1, 2, and 3. The first one is dense regular, CT, and it gets its name because of how it looks. Its fibers are arranged very regularly, almost in perfect parallel to each other, like this. That's why it's called dense regular. This is a very fibrous connective tissue. We don't see quite as many living cells. There are some in there, interspersed. We just don't see a whole lot of them. So dense regular is basically a bunch of packed collagen fibers. And you know what collagen fibers are now. They're the strong ones. So this has great strength to it. The fibers are parallel. And where do we find this? So I'm going to write location. We find this type of tissue mostly in tendons and ligaments. Tendons attach muscle to bone. Ligaments attach bone to other bone. So this stuff, it resists tension. It's very strong. I don't want to go to a new board. I'll just write over here. Resist tension. Connects. These are functions of it. It also has poor vascularization. Doesn't mean none. It just means not very much. I'm running out of space down here. My whiteboard's running out. I'll try to write it up here. Poor, not much of a blood supply. All right, let's move on. We're still talking about dense connective tissues. I'm finished with number 1, dense regular CT. The next one under this category, B, is dense irregular connective tissue. And this stuff is bundled. It's thicker and less regularly arranged. So it gets its name because when we look at it, it basically looks like a mess. It stains red or pink because of the type of stain that we apply to it and that the tissue and fibers and cells pick up. But you can see it's not parallel fibers. It just looks like a mess of tissue like this. That's its general appearance. The bundles are thicker and arranged much less regularly. That's where it gets its name, irregular CT. But it's still quite densely packed. The location, it's mostly in the deep dermis of the skin. It's highly vascularized, unlike dense regular. So it has a rich blood supply, and its main functions are that it anchors, connects. So I'll write that. It anchors more superficial layers of the skin to deeper layers of tissue. So it connects tissues to other tissues. It also helps cushion and supply nutrition. Whenever something is highly vascular, that means it has a rich blood supply, of course, but in that blood are nutrients. All right, let's go on to our last of the loose connective tissues, and that's, sorry, the last of the dense, that's elastic connective tissue. I'm going to write this one out because I don't want you. Later, we're going to talk about elastic cartilage, and it's very confusing. They're not the same tissue. So that's why I wrote out the full name of this one. Elastic connective tissue is full of elastin protein and elastic fibers. That's where it gets its name. So right away, it's going to tell you that it has the ability to recoil. So it allows for distension, and I'm going to write that as well. Distension just means to stretch. Obviously, recoil means to snap back into its original shape. We find this stuff loaded in the walls of arteries, mostly arteries, but also veins. When blood goes surging through, by the way, I'll draw a quick picture of it. This tissue, the fibers look like this, but they are somewhat parallel to each other. When we look at it under a microscope, these long elastic fibers. And this, if we find this stuff in the wall of a vessel like an artery, so I'm going to draw an artery, there's the lumen where the blood is. This is where we find that stuff. And when blood surges through this vessel, it has to dilate and then snap back into position or recoil. So as a surge of blood goes through here, it causes the walls to expand. And then after that surge of blood has passed by, the artery or vein snaps back into its original diameter or position. All right, we have finished now. Just going back and looking at my notes that I jotted down before this lecture. So we've done connective tissue proper, loose connective tissues, dense connective tissues. Now I'm going to go to cartilage, which is a whole new subcategory. So if you have your outline that I posted for you on the Canvas, if you have that in front of you, you can easily follow along with how this categorization is going. So we're finished with connective tissue proper, which was a big number 1. Now I'm going to put a big number 2 and talk about cartilage. I told you this is a nightmare, and it is. It was a nightmare for me when I was a student too, to try to organize all of this business and remember where everything fits into, which is why I put that outline for you on our Canvas page. So just to give you some general characteristics of cartilage, and then I'm going to list the main types of cartilage. There's 3 main types, but cartilage in general, we know what cartilage is and we know where it is on our body, most of the places anyway. It's tough, strong, but it also has some flexibility to it. So those are general characteristics. We find this stuff really between dense connective tissue and bone in its characteristics, in its flexibility and strength. It is almost, not completely, almost avascular. That means there's almost very, very little blood supply. Not completely, but almost. The matrix, the non-living part of this connective tissue, the matrix contains specific molecules, something called chondroitin. That's chondroitin, chondroitin sulfate. sulfate. Sorry about the writing, I'm on a glass surface. It also contains hyaluronic acid. Hyaluronic acid is also found in synovial fluid. When we talk about joints, I'll talk more about that. It's full of fluid. The matrix is full of fluid. It's kind of like this hard jelly-like fluid. It's not complete fluid. But I'm just going to put it's about 80% water. Chondroblasts. We know what those are. Those are immature cartilage cells that secrete something. They secrete new matrix. This is the predominant cell type in cartilage itself. Now I'm going to just briefly talk about the 3 types of cartilage. We might get into bone a little bit before we stop. So I'm going to write letter A. These are specific types. Hyaline cartilage is the most common in the human body. It's the first type or specific type on the list. So first thing I'm going to write is most abundant. It makes up something called, this tissue makes up something called articular cartilage. That means we find this on the ends of long bones. The bones in the human body, I'm just going to draw a generic bone over here, where they articulate with another bone, we find a layer of hyaline cartilage. It's called articular cartilage because articulation means to form a joint with another bone, a connection. So in this joint, what I'm drawing in blue would be hyaline cartilage. And it's also called articular cartilage in this case because we're at a joint, an articulation. That provides a smooth, glassy surface for the bones to articulate with each other so that bone doesn't grind on bone. Osteoarthritis is the wearing away of this hyaline cartilage at our joints. And when bone eventually grinds on bone, that's what causes inflammation and pain. So I'm going to go back to my black pen and just write a few more things about hyaline cartilage. Its main function is support and articulation. So we find it on the ends of long bones. There are some other places we find additional locations besides the ends of long bones would be, we find it in the trachea, Our trachea is our air pipe, our windpipe. We find hyaline cartilage, if this is our trachea, we find hyaline cartilage rings lining this tube that provides support for the trachea to stay open 24 hours a day, even when we're sleeping, because we need constant air supply. One last classic location, hyaline cartilage. Let's do two. The end of the nose and we find hyaline cartilage on the ends of our ribs, connecting our ribs to the sternum. So I'm going to write ribs, sternum connection. Those are the main locations in the body. So that's A, hyaline cartilage. Let's do B now, elastic cartilage. I think that's next on your list. It usually is. Now, I don't want you to confuse elastic cartilage with elastic connective tissue. We just did elastic connective tissue. That's the stuff that we find in our vessel walls. Elastic cartilage is obviously more solid than elastic connective tissue, and it is mostly found in the outer ear. Sorry, I forgot my R. What you and I call the ear is really mostly elastic. That's the thing that you can grab and bend on the outside of your head. That is made up of elastic cartilage. We also find elastic cartilage in the epiglottis, which is that flap of cartilage that covers your trachea when you swallow food so that food doesn't go down your trachea. So this is full of elastic fibers, some characteristics. You know that those provide recoil. So if you were to grab your ear and bend it forward and let go, it snaps back into position because it's full of those elastic fibers. So it allows for stretchability or distension and recoil. I'm not going to say a lot more about this one. Let's go quickly on to C, fibrocartilage. This is our last cartilage, by the way. This is full of thick collagen fibers. That's where it gets its name, fibrocartilage. And you know that collagen fibers provide strength. So it's a really tough tissue. It also has chondrocytes. They're more prominent. I'm just going to write more abundant. The chondrocytes are what's helping secrete the collagen for the collagen fibers. The locations of this stuff we find in intervertebral discs, the discs in your back between the bones. And in the knee joint, you've heard of a meniscus. That's mostly fibrocartilage. So I'm just going to draw very quickly two vertebrae. Look, this is a lateral view from the side. This would be the front, anterior. This is the back, posterior. So there's a bone in your vertebrae. Here's the vertebral bone right below it. Between these two bones, we have fibrocartilage. It's called an intervertebral disc. That allows bone not to grind on bone, but it's not hyaline cartilage tissue, it's fibrocartilage. And its main function is it provides cushion and shock absorption. It's a big one. Every time you take a step, and especially if you're walking or running on a hard surface, shock waves go up through your body and through, of course, your vertebral column, your spine. And all of these discs between our 24 vertebrae help absorb that shock that goes through your body. Likewise, in our knee joint, there's a lot of shock absorption in that joint as well. So it cushions shock absorption. It also supports to some degree. So we've just got a few minutes left. I'm going to start bone. I probably won't finish bone, although I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the details of bone, because after we take our second lecture quiz, which will be on Thursday, we're gonna do the skeletal system as a whole system, and I will tell you more about bone than you probably ever want to know at that point. So I'm just going to layer on one more board here and start talking about bone. Oh, let me get my black marker out here. So 2 was cartilage. I'll put a big number 3 here, bone, for our connective tissues. Some general functions of bone. You know that it's for support, protection, may or may not know this bit, stores minerals, mostly calcium, and fat, by the way, stores minerals, fat. It is also the site, bone is the site of blood cell synthesis. All of our red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets are synthesized inside of bone tissue. So those are just some general main functions. Some other characteristics: the matrix is very hard and tough. It contains some different things than cartilage. It contains calcium salts, and collagen fibers. The calcium salts make bone really hard and almost brittle. The collagen fibers give strength, tensile strength. Collagen fibers in bone are almost like rebar going through concrete. The concrete mix provides real hardness, and the rebar, the metal bars going through big forms of concrete, provide tensile strength and some flexibility. Okay, osteoblasts would be immature bone cells that secrete new matrix. Osteocytes would be mature bone cells that no longer secrete, but they just maintain that matrix. 2 types of bone. I'm just going to write 2 major bone tissue types. Let's go over those and we'll call it a day. And you can ask me anything you like. 2 main bone tissue types. First, I'll use the letter A, is compact bone. This is what you and I think of when we hear the word bone. It's very hard, dense, densely packed bone, as opposed to spongy bone. Spongy bone is less dense, much less dense. Spongy bone is made up of tiny little bone spicules or needles like this. And it's not air spaces between these little bone struts or needles. It's cells, it's fluid, and actually it's bone marrow. So the red stuff that I'm drawing in here is a jelly-like mixture of stem cells, capillaries, So spongy bone is made up of these tiny little bone needles, and then it has red marrow. So I'm going to write out here, contains. I'm going to talk about these in great detail when we do the skeletal system. This is just a real brief overview. It contains red marrow, and that's where blood cells are synthesized. Okay, I think we've reached pretty much where we need to be. Tomorrow I will pick up with fluid connective tissues, briefly talk about muscular and nervous tissue, and then possibly start talking about the skin. Just to let you guys know, I'm going to post the new second week's outline, even though we're not finished with the first week yet. I'm going to try to post week 2's outline later today, and that will contain a daily outline of what we are going to do, what you're expected to complete, and it will also post the next couple quizzes. But just to give you a heads up, and I posted this at the end of week one outline, our quiz number 2 is going to be Thursday. I originally had it scheduled for this coming Friday, but because it's a holiday weekend, I thought, and I'm only going to quiz you on what we cover, so don't worry about it's going to be, well, it'll probably actually cover a little bit less material being Thursday rather than Friday. If I were to make it Friday, I would just put more information on it. Nevertheless, so quiz number 2 will be coming on Thursday. It'll be open from 12 till midnight. I'll post all of this business in writing. Let me just call back up. So I'm going to post all this business in the next outline just to give you an idea of what a daily routine of what to get into for week 2. Let me stop my recording and then I'll give you a chance to ask any questions you'd like.